Thank you, Phyllis. We are so excited to have you share your leadership in this grant initiative over the next 5 years. Thank you, Pastor Lester, for joining us today to start this conversation. I have some handouts that you may take now. I don't know whether they're on the table but if they are, called and Caller, a Theology of Vocation, Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose Initiative, CLM, the Lilly Endowment Initiative, American Baptist College Innovation Hub, our Garnet Neighbor Lectures. That's the title. It's on front and back. So that we can take advantage of the full time together, Pastor Lester and I are going to talk about calling, and being called as it relates to leadership. We're going to be talking about leadership and the other component of this calling, caller, over the next 5 years so that the leader or leadership of churches can have a creative capacity to engage what and how God and communities call each other to God's purpose in the world. So what does it mean to be called to lead lives of meaning and purpose? This is the question. What does it mean to be called to lead lives of meaning and purpose? And that calling to lead lives of meaning and purpose is over the span of life, not one definite, final moment, not something fixed and non-fluid, but what does it mean to be called or have callings over a lifetime that will help us lead lives of meaning and purpose in the world as we seek to respond to God, the communities, and the relationships that shape who we are. Our traditional understandings of call has been fixed in a tradition of leadership that is not open to more callings or creative nuances of what a call or callings mean. Our callings have been somewhat understood as a distant God with a fixed providence and purpose for your life. A distant God with a fixed purpose and providence over one's life, rather than a God who is in relationship with one's life and the lives of people around them, so that we may develop listening practices to continue to hear God's call. There's nothing more tragic for leadership than to stop hearing God's callings. I've been called to preach is the kind of way in which we anchor a sense of call. But over a lifetime, that call must hear God's calling over and over again. So to be fixed and absolute in one specific moment in one's life about a call and not understand that calling must be open to how God will continue to speak as God calls purpose and meaning into your life. So that's where we want to start. In the handout, I say, what does it mean to be called to lead lives of meaning and purpose? Calling over a span of life. What does it mean to talk about God's callings in relationship to the duration of our lives? Those pastors that may be in the room, Brother Brooks and others over 30 years plus, and those who may have been in 10 years, or those who are just getting started. But particularly as you have conversations with each other as we break up, I think Brother Brooks and others will tell the younger pastors that they've had to have listening practices to hear God's call over and over again, that the call is never concrete and fixed. And when it does become concrete and fixed, it becomes provincial and limiting and not open, not broadening the capacity for us to understand God in new contexts and in relationships that were not as obvious or not as active when we experience a moment of call. So that is an important question. Then if we have, as church leaders and congregations, if we are involved in conversation in a cohort to reflect upon a life as calling in these areas that we call leadership thinking, or ways to think to connect a life of callings to justice and to flourishing and to openness as to how God might involve us, then we must, in terms of leadership, re-examine what it means to be called, to lifelong listening practices. And that is the task of what we hope over the next 5 years that we will develop, is listening. Let me give a story, and so I can anchor what I'm going to say in my own journey. I started out as a facility compliance officer with the federal government to do government-owned contractor-operated compliance reviews under Executive Order 11246. I still remember the executive order. As a sense of my career as a college graduate, first Knoxville College, to have a responsible life and participation in community, raising a family and living the conveniences of whatever my income and job would provide. That was it. That was it. Until purpose and meaning began to grab at a deeper level than that achievement. And not knowing that the relationships that had shaped me as a boy growing up in Spring Hill in Memphis, Tennessee, the church, my mother, my father, who was a deacon, my mother, who was just in the church all the time, all of them, the preacher, I love the Lord, he heard my cry and pitied every groan. Long as I live while trouble rise, I'll hasten unto his throne. I didn't know that was marking me, marking my sense of who I was in relationship with my mother, my father, and my brothers and sisters. Until after graduating from college, going into the professional world, it began to rise up and grab hold of my thinking and my sense of who I was in a way that my professional life did not anchor me. And I opened myself up by becoming a deacon of the church, or being chosen to become a deacon of the church and a Sunday school teacher. And I thought that was satisfied, and it did not. I tried to teach Sunday school, but I didn't know at the time that was a calling, could have been. Or being a servant leader in the church as deacon was a calling. And I didn't even know that in my professional work as a compliance officer, to make sure that people receiving grants from the federal government were not discriminating against people of color and women, was also a calling. I didn't know how to connect meaning and purpose to my life as a beginning professional as a calling. And during that period, I was the head compliance officer for a review of Timex Corporation in Little Rock, Arkansas, who were making time increments and so forth for NASA at the time. And they had an affected class, women doing the same job as men but receiving less pay. And when we walked in the plant and found that affected class, the commercial that was popular at the time when we found it, and they had their corporate lawyers there, and I'm the only one there as the compliance review from the government, but I had the whole government on my side. I knew that, EEOC and the like. I said, you have an affected class. You can get your lawyers involved. I can get the Department of Labor lawyers involved. But that commercial says you pay now or pay later. Pay me now, pay me later. You remember that? And they decided to pay now because I knew it was an affected class. My point is, they corrected that affected class and awarded about a $1.3 million affected class remedy for those women, most of who were black. I didn't understand that as a call. But justice was done for those women who were experiencing discrimination based on sex. If I had understood that as call and be able to apply the good news of God to that call, I could still be in that arena, but I had a traditional understanding of what? Call, that excluded me being called within the structures and systems of injustice in our society. And therefore opened myself up for further experiences of that call, and I felt it was being called to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, which meant for me to resign that government job, which I did, and come to American Baptist College. I already had an undergraduate degree now, Knoxville College, but I heard preaching and others demonstrate something that I thought was most powerful. Still having this understanding of call, and I came here to be retooled and to be educated in the theological, biblical understandings of God's life in the world. Well, the rest is history. Now, sometimes, Brother Lee, I think I got it right, but sometimes I think I got it wrong. I don't know a preacher that is worth his or her salt that always has clarity and certainty that you got it right. And if you do have that certainty, you're of a different cloth, that the cloth that weaved my sense of God's relationship with me. Because as it ends up, the call that now I share and feel God is calling is not in the church, so to speak, as a pastor preacher, but a call in education, theological education, that has me before you today, living it out. So that's my own experience of having an understanding of call. So within the ecclesial life of expressions of Christian faith, we have traditionally thought of call as a fixed purpose for a distant God, examining callings rather than over a lifetime. If God is not fixed, can you say God is not fixed? Then calling can't be fixed. If God is always open to enter into the spaces of human life in ways that challenge you to rethink one's life, meaning, and purpose, then we must always be open and fluid to God's callings. So, first consideration, number one, is on your handout. Call is relational between, read it with me, the caller, calling, and called. The caller. God is the caller, how does God call? And if the calling is from the one who calls, how does the called understand that process? I think you have to understand and grasp and understanding of all three. I have so many students. I've been called to preach, but they don't have understanding of the caller or the calling. And then they proceed to try to live out a call without a understanding of the relationality of all three. So that's one. Number one, call is relational between the caller, calling, and call. And by relational, I mean God's calling happens in what? Relationships. Relationship with people, relationships within the context where people have relationships, and one's relationship with God. And God is involved in that relationality. Brooks is a family of preachers going back to his dad, so forth and so on, and a history. That context and that relationship has something to do about his relational understanding of his own life. It ended up that it impacted him in a way that he discerned that his life was be in that arena. But for me, my son, he ain't got nothing, he don't want nothing to do with it. He's vice president of Lululemon in Vancouver, Canada. And he was in church every Sunday. I drilled it in, you know what? But that was not how God dealt with him. But sometimes we have a context and a tradition of imposing what it means for us. And how much have we robbed the church of creativity because we've imposed an ecclesial understanding of call and not know how to celebrate a mother who feels called just to be a mother, to raise children healthy. How much have we robbed the church of creativity and yield great potential for people simply because we don't understand business persons as being called of God to do business in a way that blesses the kingdom of God, to be enterprising around the resources that God makes available in the world and organize those resources in a way for the flourishing of the community. And sometimes business persons in the church, if you don't have a place for them to be trustees, they have no place. Because we are limiting the relationality and quality of how God enters into the diverse spaces of our relationships. Second Corinthians, so the calling is integral to human personhood or to human personality. God in our relationships, in the network of our identities, works in and through those relationships and identity to speak to us in ways that bring meaning and purpose into our lives. Wife's husband, God's calling. It's a whole difference to understand one's family and marriage as a calling. But most of the time we exclude a sense of God's calling in that relationship. And how much do we end up not yielding much fruit and much enrichment because our families are not seen as a calling. And we abuse our families, exploit our families, neglect our families. I'll speak for myself. I don't have to speak for you. I miss my calling within the understanding of my family and impoverish them because I thought calling was fixed. A distant God with a providential plan that I had to discover rather than seeing that it was in relationship within the very family God had blessed me with. So thirdly, if calling is discerned through relationship, what does that do in terms of our sense of leadership, or the spaces in which we share leadership? And most of the time we see leadership as an expression of leadership in the church as pastors. And leadership then becomes prescribed based on the ecclesial history and traditions that have shaped us. It becomes hierarchical. God's going to give the pastor the vision for the church. Hierarchical. God is going, the church calls me to lead the church so that I can listen to God. God shares the vision with me, and then I come and share it with the people. If there's some transparency in the room, how many of you have either suffered under that vision or still think that is what's working in the life of the church? I'll raise mine. Even as it relates to leadership of American Baptist College. As president, God's going to give the president the vision for the college. And the president shares the vision of the college with the academic dean. And the academic dean shares the president's vision with the faculty. And the students become the recipient of a hierarchy that does not service the creativity God has called them to. So rather than the reason why we got this grant, or we participated, or we were sent the RFP, is because I've been sharing at the level of Lily engagement and peer groups that a sense of vision for black institutions. We've always suffered under hierarchies of oppression and privilege that robbed our institutions of their capacity building. So we mimic models of white institutions. We mimic models of dominant paradigms of academia rather than in relationship with each other. Our churches become fragmented and isolated. Phyllis, will you help me when I'm up on 30 minutes? I think I've been going pretty good. We isolate our churches even in that vision. So the churches don't know how to be participatory in community with each other because everybody has a calling. We'll do most of the work in terms of saying that people have gifts, and we use that passage in Paul to help people, but we only want them to exercise the gift within the hierarchy of our vision. So when some communal challenge to the life of the community is upon the life of a church for relevance, we have no way of collaborating because calling is fixed, hierarchical, and the leadership is usually male. 2 minutes. So I'm going to let Pastor Lester come, but I wanted to get to this model, and he's going to do about the same time I've done, and then we might have some time to kind of bridge these together. But you remember Samuel, the boy, who did not yet know God was in his life. And he heard, but he couldn't discern what he heard, so he needed intergenerational wisdom to help him hear what he was hearing. We've cut off intergenerational wisdom. We're not talking to each other. Brooks ought to be talking to young pastors, young people, period. Pastors are not. Laity, intergenerational wisdom to help us hear what we think we're hearing. And the intergenerational wisdom said is in relationship, right? Israel is in relationship with God. Israel is in relationship with its ancestors. And Israel is in relationship with the future God wants for it. But Samuel, the boy, is hearing about that in the context of Israel at the time. But he couldn't discern it. So a process is needed for leadership to develop listening practices to help us hear. And if we hear appropriately, and I love this statement, we become, on the back, we become who we are as unique persons through what? Who comes into a person's life may be the single greatest factor of influence to what that life becomes. Ed Sanders in my life, and I may be in his, in a way that we never had an idea that entering into each other's lives and space will lead to our efforts, a calling to prevent our people from dying from HIV and AIDS. Is that right, Ed? I never dreamed it. But who comes into your life, comes into a person's life, that person may be the singular, or those relationships may be the singular greatest factor that influence what that life becomes. The boy Samuel went to Eli, says, "What am I hearing?" And this innovation hub, this cohort, this leadership has to be vulnerable and open enough to ask lay people, what am I hearing? Rather than the lay people coming to you, asking you what you're hearing. It ought to be a reciprocity, because God's call is not fixed. And if God's call is not fixed and fluid, that calling, the relationship between the call, the calling, and the caller ought to be open to listening practices. And we'll see if some of those listening practices for leadership may have some impact on how we understand how we might involve ourselves in a new sense of call.